They took me and my sister after they raided our village.
Why now?
He saved a stranger on the dusty road. What rose from the desert changed his fate forever. The town of Dustfall was a deep, festering wound on the face of the desert, and its dust was a poison that clung to everything. I knew this not from living there, but from the men who came from it. Men with dust in their teeth and shadows in their eyes. For weeks, I had followed the trail of the Scorpion Gang, the men who had stolen me, my sister, and my daughter. My sister was dead, a victim of their brutality, and my daughter, my little Ilara, was now a prisoner. I had escaped, my body bruised, my heart a hollow ache, and I was running on nothing but the fire of vengeance. My face was a mask of dust and fatigue, my arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage, but the pain was a ghost compared to the pain in my heart. All I had left was a knife, a piece of my old life, and a promise I had to keep. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. I walked into the sheriff's office in Dustfall, the place where all the broken men came to be even more broken. The man inside was cleaning a rifle, his face hard and his eyes tired. He had the look of a man who had lost too much, a man who had seen too much. I walked toward his desk, the silence in my steps a contrast to the noise of the town. I placed the knife on the wood. Not a hunting knife, but a war knife, a blade meant for a fight. I saw his eyes flicker, from the knife to my face. He was surprised, but there was no fear in his eyes, only a deep, cold weariness. "This is for you," I said, my voice low and rasping from days of silence. "And this is for him." He looked from the knife to my face, his hands still on the rifle. "For who?" "The one you lost," I said, and the words were a bitter taste on my tongue. The man with the laugh that was too loud for the open air. He flinched. The look of surprise in his eyes was replaced by a cold, hard rage. He knew what I was talking about. He had heard the stories. The men who had killed his brother had laughed about it, but he had not heard the truth. "How do you know that?" he asked, his voice low. "I was there," I said. "They forced me to watch." "No?" His grip tightened on his rifle. "You were with them?" "No," I said, and a flicker of defiance sparked in my soul. "I was a prisoner, a slave. They took me and my sister after they raided our village. They used us for a week, then a month. They were on their way to the coast, to sell us. They killed your brother because he was a good man, because he saw what they were doing. They were drunk, and they were tired. They drove their wagon over the side. Your brother and his men died, but so did they, and I was there. I saw the tremor run through him. Not a tremor of fear, but of an old, deep rage. It was the same rage that burned in my own soul. I saw the question in his eyes. Why now? Because they have something of mine, I said, my voice steady. Something I want back. They have my daughter. They will trade her for a life. I saw his stomach drop. He understood. He understood the kind of trade this was. A life for a life. His eyes held a silent question. Will you trade yourself for your daughter? Yes, I said, but they don't trust me. They know I will kill them to get her back. They want a man who is a man of honor, a man who will protect her, a man who will give me his word, and I want them to pay for what they did. I will lead you to them. I will help you, and you will help me get my daughter back. You will protect her, and then you will give me your word that you will let me go, that you will not try to stop me from doing what I must do. I saw him stand up, his body tense, his eyes unwavering. He was a man of honor, but he was also a man who had been hurt, a man who didn't trust easily. And what makes you think I can do that? What makes you think I want to? He asked. You are a man of honor, I said, my voice still quiet but firm. You protect the weak. You are a man who has lost, a man who wants justice. Ember. I looked at him, my face bruised and cut, my eyes unwavering. The anger that had been simmering in him for so long felt like a cold stone. He wanted to kill them, not just for his brother, but for me. I don't trust you, he said finally. You don't have to, I said. You have the knife, you have my word, and I have the truth. We are both running from something. We are both looking for a way out. This is the only way. Lo, I watched him as he looked at the knife again, the polished wood of the handle and the glint of the blade. It was a promise carved in steel. He picked it up. His hand closed around the hilt. "All right," he said. "I'll help you, but you will tell me everything. Every last detail." My body relaxed slightly, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. "They call themselves the Scorpion Gang. There are 3 of them. They are hiding in the canyons east of here. I will take you there." He looked at the knife again, at the symbol of death and loss. But in his hands, it was a promise of justice, of redemption. It was the first thing that had felt real in a long time. They had to pay, and I was going to make sure they did. His face, once a mask of weary anger, now held a new, grim determination. He looked from the knife to me, his gaze sweeping over my bruised face and the stained bandage on my arm. He was seeing the truth of my words, a story etched in blood and loss. "When do we ride?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. "Tonight," I said. "They won't be expecting us. They think I'm still their little bird in a cage, waiting to be sold." He nodded, a single, decisive motion. "Go get some rest, and a real meal. I'll get the horses ready." I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. "What's your name?" he asked. I paused, the name I had carried for so long feeling foreign on my tongue. "Call me Lily." He didn't respond. He just watched me go, his eyes still fixed on the knife on his desk. He was a man with a new purpose, a new path carved out of the dust of his past. And I, a woman who had lost everything, was about to become his ghost, his guide, his vengeance. We were 2 broken souls, standing on the precipice of a future that was bound by a shared desire for justice, a justice that would taste of blood and dust, but would, for the first time in a long time, feel like redemption. The journey to the canyons was a silent one. The sun was a white-hot furnace, and the desert shimmered with heat. I rode a slow, tired pony I'd stolen, and he rode beside me, his rifle resting across his saddle. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My voice was a stranger to me now. He didn't ask questions. He seemed to understand that words were a luxury I could not afford. I led him through the maze of red rock formations, twisted and carved by wind and time. I knew these lands. I had grown up on them. They were a part of me, and I was a part of them. I moved with a silent grace that spoke of years of survival, and I saw him watching me, not as a pawn, but as something else, something fierce and unbroken. We came to a high ridge overlooking a small, hidden canyon. Below us, I saw the ruins of my people's camp. The wickiups were burned, the cooking fires were cold, and the ground was littered with broken pottery and tattered blankets. My heart clenched. This was where the men had done their work. This was where my people were killed. I dismounted, the soft thud of my boots on the sand feeling loud and profane. The sheriff stayed on his horse, his eyes sweeping the scene below. "This is where they took us," I said, my voice a low murmur. "This is where my people were killed." His hand went to the handle of his Colt. I saw the old hatred flicker in his eyes. I knew what he was thinking. He was thinking of the lie he had lived with for so long, the lie that my people were responsible for his brother's death. But I also saw the shame in his eyes. He had been so wrong, and he was about to see just how wrong he had been. He dismounted and crouched, his eyes scanning the ground. I saw his face go pale. He saw the tracks, not of my people but of the boot prints, the empty whiskey bottles, the broken bits of a saddle, and the unmistakable mark of a wagon wheel. His blood went cold. "It wasn't them," he whispered. "It wasn't your people. It was the gang." I knelt beside him. "They were on their way to the coast to sell me and my sister," I said. "Your brother and his men stumbled upon them here. They fought. It was a short battle. The gang had more men, more guns. They killed your brother. They took his rifle and his horse. The lie he had lived with for so long shattered. All those years, all that hate, all the bitterness. It wasn't the Apache. It was these men, these scavengers." I rose slowly and pointed to a narrow pass in the canyon wall. "The canyon is a trap," I said. "The only way out is through the pass. They're hiding there." I looked at him, and I saw the look of shame in his eyes. He had blamed the wrong people. He had let a lie fester in his heart, and had lived a life of quiet desperation because of it. He had let a lie take root in him. I saw the strength in his eyes, the determination to right a wrong. He was not the enemy. He was the one who was going to help me get my daughter back. "They will have lookouts," I said. "And my daughter. They will be watching." He looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. "I know these canyons," I said. "I know where they will be." That. I didn't need to say more. He understood. We moved like ghosts, silent, swift. I led him through narrow crevices and along ledges that seemed to defy gravity. I was a natural hunter, a part of the landscape, and he was my shadow. We came to a small cave hidden behind a waterfall. The sound of water was loud enough to muffle our approach, but I could smell the smoke from their fire. "They are in there," I whispered, my voice low and steady. "And my daughter is with them." Lo. We waited until nightfall. The moon rose, a sliver of white in a sky of black velvet, and the canyon floor was cast in shadows. He moved in first, his rifle ready. I saw him take the men out one by one. He was a man of his word. He was a man of honor. He was a man who was fighting for justice, not just for his brother, but for me. The last man, the leader, the one who had taken my daughter, fell. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, my eyes sweeping the cave. Silence. The fire crackled, and the waterfall roared. He went inside, his rifle held high. In the back of the cave, in the shadows, I saw her, my daughter, my little Ilara. She was clutching a dirty doll, her eyes wide with fear. My hand went to my mouth. I let out a soft cry. I ran to her and pulled her into my arms, holding her close, a sob racking my body. She didn't speak, didn't cry. She just held on to her mother, as if her life depended on it. I looked at him, standing in the doorway, his rifle held high. He was watching us, his face a mask of exhaustion and relief. The girl was alive, the debt was paid, but a new one had just begun. The debt of a woman who had been a fool for so long, and a man who had shown her the truth. I had done what I had to do. Now, the real work began. But something in the silence of the cave gnawed at me. Ilara's small arms clung to my neck, but her eyes weren't the same. They were wide, unblinking, darting past me to the sheriff. "Why won't she speak?" I whispered, brushing her hair back. "Why does she tremble still, even when the men are dead?" Jack crouched beside one of the bodies, turning it over with his boot. His breath hissed through his teeth. On the man's chest, stitched crudely into the leather vest, was a silver badge bent, blackened by fire but unmistakable. A sheriff's badge. For a moment I thought it was his. Jack froze, staring at it as though it were a ghost. Then his face hardened. "That's my brother's," he muttered. His voice was hoarse, raw. "The bastards took it after they killed him, but there was something else. The badge wasn't just a trophy. Carved into the leather vest beneath it was a symbol, two scorpions circling each other, tails raised. Not just a mark, a brand. They weren't just thieves," I said, my throat dry. "They were bound, blood-bound." That. Jack looked at me sharply, then back at the corpse. His hand trembled as he pulled a folded piece of parchment from the dead man's pocket. He opened it, and I saw his knuckles go white. "What is it?" I asked. He handed it to me without a word. It was a crude map of Dustfall. Lines marked the saloon, the stables, the bank, and finally, the sheriff's office. At the bottom, in smudged ink, were 3 words that made my stomach drop. "Inside man secured. Lee." I looked up at Jack, my heart pounding. "They had someone in your town, one of your own." His jaw clenched, muscles jumping. I saw fury twist across his face, but beneath it was something worse, doubt. Ilara whimpered against me, and I held her tighter. The truth struck like a knife. The Scorpion gang hadn't just killed his brother and slaughtered my people. They had an ally in Dustfall, feeding them information, shielding their crimes. And now, every lawman Jack had trusted, every handshake, every nod in the saloon, they all carried the stench of betrayal. The cave seemed to close in on us. Jack's hand hovered over his Colt, but not at me, not at my daughter. It trembled because for the first time, he realized he didn't know who the real enemy was. And neither did I. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The ride back to Dustfall was different. The silence was still there, but it wasn't the same. It was no longer the silence of suspicion, but the silence of two souls who had found a fragile truth in the middle of the desert. Ilara rode in front of me, her small arms clinging to my waist. She hadn't spoken a word since we pulled her from that cave. But she was warm now, alive, and that was enough. The sun was sinking by the time we reached the edge of town. Dustfall was quiet in that eerie way small towns get before something bad happens. The windows of the saloon flickered with lamplight, and the usual chorus of drunken laughter had turned into a low murmur. Jack led us through the back alley, away from the main street, to his office. The back room was small, clean, sparse, a cot, a stove, a basin. But to us, it was sanctuary. Ilara's eyes darted around the room. I could see her mind trying to decide if this was a trap or a home. I sat with her on the cot, pressing my forehead to hers. "You're safe," I whispered. I didn't believe it, but she needed to hear it. Jack stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes far away. I thanked him, and he shrugged, like it was nothing, but I could see the storm behind his eyes. The truth we'd uncovered in that canyon had shattered something in him. The story he had built his life on his brother's death, the righteous hatred was gone. All that was left was a raw, gnawing question. What now? That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the soft breaths of my daughter and the heavier, restless shifting of the man across the room. I had spent years building walls inside myself, but tonight, they felt paper thin. The next morning, I found myself humming an old Apache lullaby as I washed Ilara's face. Her eyes softened, her body unwound. For the first time since the raid, I saw a flicker of the girl she had been. Jack watched us quietly from his desk. He looked like a man out of place in his own skin, like a gunslinger who had laid down his gun and didn't know what to do with his hands anymore. The days passed slowly. I cooked, cleaned, kept to myself. Jack came and went, always tense, always watching. Dustfall was not a kind place. I felt the stares on my back when I walked to fetch water. Heard the whispers, savage, squaw, witch. The town had not changed. Only Jack had. One evening, I brought him a cup of coffee. I sat across from him and said quietly, "You are not at peace." He didn't look up. "I've never been at peace." "You gave me my daughter back," I said. "That matters." He sighed. "You have your daughter, but not a home." "And you?" I asked. "You gave us shelter, but you're not safe either." He looked at me then, really looked. And for a moment, I saw the truth in his eyes. He was tired. Tired of being the only man in town trying to hold the line. Tired of protecting people who didn't deserve it. Tired of living for a lie. That night, long after Ilara had fallen asleep, I heard something. A creak. A shift of weight. Jack was already moving. He grabbed his rifle and pressed a finger to his lips. He motioned to the window. Outside, in the dark alley, a shadow stood, watching. Waiting. Jack burst through the doorway, Colt raised. A figure bolted down the alley, coat flapping like wings in the dark. Jack aimed low and fired. The gunshot tore the night apart. The man staggered, clutching his side, but he didn't fall. With a burst of desperation, he vanished into the labyrinth of Dustfall's crooked streets. Jack gave chase, but the trail dissolved in the maze of shadows and shuttered windows. He stopped, chest heaving, listening to the silence. Only the distant howl of a coyote answered. The man was gone wounded, but alive. When Jack returned to the office, his face was carved from stone. "They know you're here," he said, "and one of my own is helping them." I felt Ilara shrink against me, her small hands twisting in my dress. Jack paced the room, his boots heavy against the floorboards. "Whoever he was, I hit him. He's bleeding. He won't hide that long." His eyes burned with a grim certainty. "Tomorrow, we'll find him, in front of everyone." The next morning, Jack called the townsfolk to the square. They came grudgingly, ranchers with dust in their beards, merchants with suspicion in their eyes, drifters smelling of whiskey. The whole of Dustfall gathered under the hard sun, restless and murmuring. Jack stood tall on the steps of the jailhouse, the badge on his chest catching the light. "Last night," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd, "someone tried to bring danger to this town. I put a bullet in him. Whoever he is, he's bleeding right now, and I'll see his wound before this day is done." A hush fell. Men glanced at one another, uneasy. One by one, Jack called them forward. Sleeves were rolled up, coats stripped away. The townsfolk muttered, some scowling at the indignity, but none dared refuse. Then came Deputy Harlan. He stepped forward slow, his jaw tight, his eyes avoiding Jack's presses. "Arm," Jack said. For a moment, Harlan didn't move. Then, reluctantly, he tugged at his sleeve. The cloth stuck to his skin. When he pulled it back, the stain was clear. Fresh blood, soaking through the bandage hastily tied around his shoulder. The crowd gasped. Jack's hand hovered over his gun, but his voice was steady, iron hard. "You've been feeding them," he said. "You nearly brought death to this town." "Joe." Harlan's face twisted with anger and fear, caught before his people, his mask ripped away. The whispers rose like dry grass set aflame. Dustfall had just learned the name of its traitor. For a long moment, no one spoke. The desert wind tugged at hats and skirts, carrying only the rattle of the hanging sign above the saloon. Then the square erupted. "Traitor!" someone spat. "He was one of us," another shouted. A woman clutched her child and backed away as if Harlan carried disease. But not all voices condemned him. A rancher with sunburnt cheeks growled, "He ain't wrong to want them gone. That woman and her kind brought trouble here." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, low and dangerous. Jack raised his hand, his voice cutting through the noise. "Quiet!" His gaze swept across the gathering, pinning each man in place. "Harlan sold out this town. He put a child's life in danger. That ain't law. That ain't justice. It's cowardice." "Lou?" Harlan's face flushed, his teeth bared. "You think you're better than us, Jack? You wear that badge, but you've forgotten what side you're on. This town wasn't built for them. It was built for us." Jack stepped down from the porch, the dust crunching beneath his boots. "This badge means I stand for the law. And the law don't draw lines of blood and skin. Not anymore." His hand rested on the butt of his Colt, but he didn't draw. Not yet. The crowd shifted uneasily, torn between the weight of old hatred and the cold finality of Jack's words. Some looked away, ashamed. Others stared hard at Alara and me, their resentment plain. The sun blazed overhead, casting every face in sharp relief. Dustfall itself seemed to hold its breath, balanced on the edge of violence. And in that silence, I knew the truth. The real battle was no longer against the gang beyond the desert. It was here, in the heart of the town, where loyalty and hatred had tangled so deep they were impossible to tell apart. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you." Jack snapped the irons on Harlan's wrists himself. No deputies, no witnesses, just him, his prisoner, and the echo of the crowd's shouts still hanging in the air outside. He shoved Harlan into the cell and slammed the iron door shut. The clang rang through the jailhouse like a verdict. Harlan leaned back against the bars, blood seeping through his shirt. His face was pale, but his eyes still burned with defiance. "You think you won, Jack?" he spat. "You think they'll let me rot in here? You're dumber than I thought. Vi." Jack stood just beyond the bars, hands folded over the keys on his belt. He didn't blink. "You're right," he said flatly. "They won't let you rot. They'll come for you, and when they do, I'll be waiting." Harlan smirked, though the expression cracked under the strain of pain. "Then I hope you shoot straighter than you did last night." Jack's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, walking back to his desk where the badge gleamed in the lamplight. He set his Colt down beside it, then sat heavily, rubbing a hand across his face. I stood near the cot with Ilera pressed to my side, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at the man in the cell. "Is he one of them?" I whispered. Jack looked up, his voice rough. "He was worse. He wore the badge." The words hung heavy in the room. The badge that was supposed to mean protection had been twisted into betrayal. For a moment, I wondered if Jack himself believed in it anymore. Hours passed. Harlan stayed silent, offering no names, no reasons. Jack tried once, leaned against the bars, voice low, asking him straight who he'd been talking to, who else in Dustfall had dirt on their hands. But Harlan only smiled, bloody teeth showing, and said nothing. By nightfall, Jack gave up asking. He didn't need to. He knew. The gang wouldn't leave one of their own in a cell, not when that man could talk, not when his silence was the only thing keeping their secrets safe. So Jack waited. The town quieted under the weight of midnight. Dust settled in the streets, lamps guttered out one by one, and the saloon's laughter died into silence. But in the jailhouse, no one slept. Jack sat in the corner chair, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the front door. I sat on the cot with Ilara curled against me, listening to the rhythm of her breath. Harlan shifted in the cell, muttering under his breath. The air was thick, charged, as if Dustfall itself knew what was coming. Just past the hour, when the night feels darkest, it began. The scrape of boots outside, the low murmur of voices trying to whisper against the wind, the faint creak of leather, and the metallic clink of spurs. Jack's eyes narrowed. He raised a finger to his lips, signaling silence, though none of us dared breathe anyway. The front door eased open with a soft groan. Shadows slipped inside, moving low, rifles and knives glinting in the lamplight. They expected an easy kill, a quick rescue. Instead, Jack rose from the chair like a specter, rifle already leveled. "Drop it," he growled. The gang froze. 4 of them, lean and ragged, their faces painted with dust and desperation. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then steel flashed. A pistol jerked upward. The first shot cracked like thunder, and the jailhouse exploded into chaos. Jack's rifle roared, and one outlaw dropped, clutching his chest. Another lunged for the cell keys, but Harlan screamed from behind the bars, "Don't! He's waiting for you!" Too late. Jack's Colt was already in his hand, barking fire. The room filled with smoke and fury. Splinters flew from the desk, glass shattered from the lamp. Ilara buried her face against me as I threw us both to the floor, covering her with my body. When the gunfire stopped, the silence that followed was louder than the storm. 3 bodies sprawled across the floorboards. One man, bleeding from his leg, groaned and tried to crawl for the door. Jack stepped forward, boot pressing down on his back. Colt aimed at his head. "Names?" Jack demanded. "Every one of you still out there." The outlaw spat blood, but Jack's boot pressed harder, and the man broke, spilling words in a rush. Names, hideouts, the paths they took through the desert, enough to burn the whole gang out of their holes. In the cell, Harlan's face drained of color. His lips parted, but no words came. Jack turned to him, eyes cold as iron. "They came for you," he said, "and they died for nothing. You still think they'll save you?" For the first time, Harlan looked afraid. Not of the outlaws, not of me, but of the man holding the badge. Jack bound the surviving outlaw and dragged him into the next cell. Then he sat down again, rifle across his knees, eyes never leaving Harlan. "You had your chance to talk," he said. "Now I'll let your brothers do the talking for you. Every last one." Dawn bled across the horizon, turning the desert sky into fire. Dustfall stirred awake, but the town was different now. Rumors already spread of gunfire in the night, of bodies carried out of the jailhouse before sunrise. The people gathered in the street, whispering, waiting for answers. Jack stepped onto the porch, coat dusted with smoke, his face drawn but unyielding. "They came for him," he told the crowd, jerking a thumb toward the jailhouse. "They came to break him out. They didn't leave alive." Gasps, murmurs, curses. Some faces showed relief, others anger. But no one stepped forward to challenge him. Jack's voice carried, steady and sharp. "This town's been living under their shadow too long. No more. We know their names. We know their holes in the desert. And I'm riding out to finish this." His eyes swept the crowd, daring them to look away. You want to stand with me, then stand. If not, stay out of the way. But understand this, Dustfall ain't theirs anymore, not while I wear this badge. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then, slowly, men began to nod. A rancher, a storekeeper, a drifter with calloused hands. The tide shifted, uncertain but real. Behind him, Harlan sat in the cell, staring out at the town he'd betrayed, the people he'd thought would turn against Jack. Instead, he watched them begin to rally. The sun rose higher, burning the shadows from the street. Dustfall was still. Dustfall harsh, bitter, divided. But that morning, for the first time in years, it looked like a place that might just be worth saving. And Jack, standing tall with his rifle and his badge, looked like the man who might just do it. The night crawled on, a heavy silence settling in the jailhouse. Jack sat at his desk, cleaning his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate. Across from him, the surviving outlaw whimpered from his cell, a low, constant sound of pain and defeat. Harlan sat motionless, staring at the wall, a hollow look in his eyes. He had nothing left to say. He was broken. I sat in the back room with Alara. The little girl had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, her hand still clutching my shirt. I watched her, memorizing the rhythm of her breath, the soft curve of her cheek in the faint lamplight. This fragile, precious life was the reason we were here, the reason Jack had risked everything. The hours felt endless. The air was thick with the stench of blood, dust, and gunpowder, a mixture that had become the scent of our survival. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the shutters, made my heart leap. We were still in the eye of the storm. Just before dawn, the streets began to stir. The town was alive with hushed whispers and the soft shuffle of boots. Word had spread like wildfire. The townsfolk were coming. Some, I knew, would be hungry for a spectacle, a public hanging. Others would be filled with fear, or even relief. But all of them would be watching. Jack stood at the door, his hand on the knob. His face was a mask of granite, but his eyes were alive with a grim certainty. He was ready to face them, the town that had both turned its back on him and was now counting on him to save it. "Stay here," he said to me, his voice a low rumble. "No matter what happens, stay here." I nodded, clutching Alara tighter. He was the law, but he was also just a man, and I felt a cold fear grip me, the kind that whispers that even the strongest men can fall. He pushed the door open, stepping out into the pale light of dawn. The crowd was silent for a moment, then a murmur rose, growing into a roar of questions and demands. Jack raised a hand. "I gave you the truth," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "The Scorpion gang is broken. They came for their man, and they found justice instead. Now, we finish this. I'm riding out to hunt down the rest of them, the ones still hiding in the desert." A new silence fell over the crowd. This was not the easy victory they had hoped for. This was an invitation to a war. "You want to stand with me?" Jack challenged, his eyes sweeping across the sea of faces. "Then get your rifles, get your horses. If not, get out of my way." The silence stretched, tense and brittle. A few men shifted, avoiding his gaze. But then, a grizzled old rancher, a man known for his stubborn pride, stepped forward. He gave a sharp nod. Then another man, a storekeeper, followed suit. Slowly, one by one, a few more men joined them. It wasn't the whole town, not even close, but it was a start. A fragile promise of unity. Jack nodded, a flicker of something close to a smile on his lips. He was no longer just the law. He was their leader. I stayed behind, watching from the window as they rode out. A small posse against the unforgiving desert, against the ghosts of a broken gang. They looked small and insignificant against the vast, brutal landscape. But they carried the weight of a town's hope on their shoulders. I went back to Alara, who was now stirring. She woke up slowly, her eyes blinking against the light. She looked at me, then at the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. "Are we safe now?" she asked, her voice small. I didn't know the answer, not with certainty, but I looked at her, at the innocent hope in her eyes, and I knew what I had to say. "Yes," I whispered, holding her close. "For now, we are. The bad men are gone. But the truth was, I wasn't so sure. Jack was gone, but the shadows he was chasing would return. The real battle was not over. But for the first time, I felt a different kind of hope, a kind that was not tied to one man, but to the idea of a town fighting for its own soul, a hope that a place like this could be healed. That a Wild West love story wasn't just about survival, but about building something better, something real. I thought of Jack, of his fierce sense of honor and his lonely burden. He was a cowboy love story in a town of shadows and ghosts, and I knew that our journey was far from over. The road stretched out before us, filled with dangers and uncertainties, but also with the promise of a new life. And I knew, with a certainty I had not felt since leaving the reservation, that a Wild West love was not just about finding a home, but about the courage to keep moving forward. Maybe, I thought as I held Alara, the best Wild West stories are not about winning the fight, but about the stubborn, unwavering will to keep fighting, no matter the cost. Because at the end of the day, a Western love story is a promise to yourself and to the people you love, that you will never stop fighting for a better future, no matter how hard the road gets. And that, I knew, was a promise worth making, and a journey worth taking. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comment. One night, while we lay in our tent, the silence between us was filled with unspoken words. I had a family, a home, a purpose, and I had a future. I turned to him, my eyes dark in the shadows. My people have a saying, I said. A man who finds his soul in the desert is a man who is born again. He didn't answer. He just held me close. He had been born again. In the quiet of the night, he made a promise to me, a promise that he would never leave us, a promise that he would always protect us, a promise that he would love us. And in the morning, when the sun rose and the world was bathed in a golden light, I knew that I was a woman of my word. My cowboy love stories were over. This was a Wild West love like no other, a Wild West love story written by the wind, the sun, and the wide, open sky. It was a story of healing, of redemption, of a love that was forged in the fire of loss and rose from the ashes stronger than ever before. We didn't know what the future held for us, but we knew one thing. We were together, we were safe, and we were home. We were not running from the past anymore. We were walking into a future filled with love, adventure, and the promise of a new day. A day where a woman who had been alone for so long finally found her place in the world. I was no longer a prisoner. I was Liliana, the wife and the mother. I was a woman with a purpose, a woman with a heart. And I was a woman who was finally free. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment AMEN below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life.